Hello, BookTube, and welcome to another weekly reading vlog. So, this week I'm going to be talking about the grammar book, an ESL EFL teacher's course by Marianne Celce-Murcia, Diane Larsen-Freeman, and the Brothers Grimm Fairy Tales by the Brothers Grimm, and briefly, hopefully, The Moral Animal by Robert Wright. So, The Moral Animal, last week I was on page 321. This week I finished it off and got my written review done and got my video review done. Posted that just yesterday. So if you haven't seen it, go check it out or not. Something that was a problem for me both in the video review and in the written review was I just had trouble summarizing the book. He makes a lot of assertions in this book, which he gives a lot of background and evidence for, and they make sense when he describes them. To summarize some of this stuff, though, doesn't make as much sense unless you go into all the background that he does. What I wanted to do was get into my own reactions to his assertions, but I found it difficult to both summarize what his arguments were and to give my own reactions to it within reasonable space confines. And the video review, I've got a 30-minute time limit. The written review, I don't have a time limit, but I do have a life to lead and a wife and kid and stuff like that, and work. So I don't want to be typing that for days and days and days. So I just tried to get some thoughts down, and then I don't know if the review is a failure, so be it. I'm going to move on to other materials. So I'm all done with this one now. Moving on next to the grammar book. So I was didn't make a lot of progress on this. I was stuck on pages 106, 107 for a bit because these were the exercises, the sentence diagramming exercises. So, working through these, not that one. Working through these sentence diagrams here, like this one here, this one here. Not that one, sorry. What am I doing? This notebook, my daughter is also drawing on it, so sometimes finding a blank page is a little bit difficult. I have to jump around. So the way you're supposed to do it is you're supposed to do the sentence diagram, then the output of the base, and then copy the subject and tense information onto the third line. It's fairly redundant, but I'm just doing it just because I like to do things like you're supposed to. I've got a certain personality type. So that got me stuck on page 106, 107 for a while, but I finally did finish up those exercises and moved on to chapter 7, the tense and aspect system. Now, tense and aspect actually is something I'm fairly familiar with just from picking it up as I go as an English teacher, as an ESL teacher. But this has a nice summary of it and includes a lot of interesting information that I wasn't always aware of. What would be an example? Can't think of something off the top of my head, but I was learning new stuff as well. Again, as I've said in previous videos, I did read up to around 200 pages of this book last year. So I'm still reviewing the stuff I read last year, but as I read through this, again, a lot of this is just like I'm reading it for the first time, for better or for worse. For better in the sense that I'm engaged with it, for worse in the sense that it's depressing to think how much you forget over a year and how little of this book will be in my long-term memory after I finish it 5 years from now, will I even remember half the stuff in this book? But no. I'll remember a few things that have stuck in my memory, but that's always the discouraging thing about reading for professional development. Okay, and then moving on next to the Brothers Grimm. Now, as I've said in previous videos, my goal for this year is to not start a lot of new books, but just finally finish off all those books on my shelf that I started but never finished. So now that I've gotten rid of The Moral Animal, finished this one off, that opens up a new space in my weekly reading, and so I'm going with the Brothers Grimm. The Brothers Grimm was something everybody is obviously familiar with, and everybody obviously knows the more famous stories, Rapunzel, Cinderella, etc. Although if you flip through this, most of these stories are stories you've never heard of. I think there's maybe like 10 stories that everybody knows. And the rest of the 210 stories in here, so 10 stories that everyone knows and then 200 stories that you've never heard of. I have had it in my mind that I'd like to read the whole thing cover to cover for many, many years now. Being a bookish person, I just thought it would be a neat little thing to cross off my reading list. However, being a slow reader, it took me a while to get around to it. Also, as I've been living abroad, I didn't always stumble across a complete edition of this. A lot of the Brothers Grimm that you pick up in bookstores is not actually the complete Brothers Grimm. For example, when I was living in Cambodia, I picked up Brothers Grimm from a bookstore there. I found it on the shelves, and I thought, oh yeah, I've always wanted to read the Brothers Grimm cover to cover. And it wasn't until I got it home that I actually realized that it was only it was only selections from the Brothers Grimm. It didn't really say abridged in big letters on the cover. It was on the small print once you opened it up. So I don't know, maybe it would be different if I was living back in the US again, but I have a feeling, unless you're making a serious study of this, which most people aren't, most copies of the Brothers Grimm you would pick up are not complete. So this is the complete one. It's all 200 canonical stories plus the 10 legends. And off the top of my head, I'm not exactly sure why the legends are in a different classification than the stories. But yeah, that's how the Brothers Grimm is organized. Some of these stories are very short, like story 200, The Golden Key. You can see it's only a paragraph. And there are actually a number of paragraph-long stories, or very short stories. On the other hand, some of them will go on for about 10 pages or so. I should note, actually, that this is the complete Brothers Grimm in the sense that this is the final edition that the Brothers Grimm published. The Brothers Grimm, throughout their lifetimes, updated and republished the book several times. I want to say 7 times, but that's just a number I've got kind of in my head for some reason. That could be wrong. Double check me on Wikipedia. And during that time, they took stories, they put new stories in, and they took stories out as they were refining what they wanted their final collection to be. So some of the stories that were in earlier editions that have been taken out are no longer in this. And I suspect, I've not seen this, but I'm pretty sure somewhere out there you could find like the complete Brothers Grimm that has all the canonical stories plus all the stories they took out. I mean, that's got to exist somewhere, right? Somebody must have published that at some time. But that's unfortunately not the version I have. I say unfortunately because I'm a bit of a completist. But you could find those stories on Wikipedia easily enough. So I don't know. Maybe I'll just look those up when I'm done. Stories that they took out. There were some stories that were a little bit too dark that they took out. Apparently, there was one story about children playing butcher. So, like, the children had kind of seen a butcher slaughtering his animals, and they decided to. They said, "Okay, let's play butcher then. I'll be the butcher, you be the animal," and just kind of not knowing what they were doing, just kind of being innocent child's play, where they were just imaginative role playing. One of them ended up slaughtering the others. I'm not sure how that story ends, but it's out there somewhere on Wikipedia, and it's one of the non-canonical Brothers Grimm stories. It's one of the ones from the earlier edition. Puss in Boots was also in an earlier edition, and I don't know why the reason for taking that one out was. So anyways, this is the complete Brothers Grimm, at least their final edition. I don't know how many people watching this video are going to be longtime viewers of this channel, but I had a project on this channel a couple years ago where I was going to read through all the Brothers Grimm and make ESL listening videos for my students to listen to and do as homework. They were mediocre videos, let's be honest. My skills as a performer or a storyteller are limited, but it was something I had fun doing to a certain extent, and it gave me an excuse to go through these stories and to really get into them. What I would do is I would take the stories and then I would rewrite them in simple English while still trying to maintain the original meaning of it. And try and walk that tightrope as best I could. Then I would record a video of me doing it. At first it was just one video, but then it ended up being 3 videos, one at slow speed, one at fast or normal speed, and then one where I wasn't reading off of the paper, but I was just telling the story from memory. The idea being that maybe that would be more natural speech, because spoken English has a different grammar than written English. So if you're reading something off of a paper, some people would say it's not really authentic listening practice to take something written and then just verbalize it. So I would retell it from memory. And then I would make up questions for my students to answer, and I would take out all the vocabulary that was more than the 500 basic vocabulary words for an elementary student, anything above that. And I would look them all up in the dictionary and take example sentences and put them in Quizlet. And I just spent way too much time doing it. This is one of those things where the project just got bigger and bigger over time. The primary reason I stopped doing that was because actually I switched to a different department. I went into teacher training instead of teaching, and so I lost the reason to do that for my weekly class. I still had this idea that I was going to maybe continue it on my own time and just make the YouTube videos, but I just never got around to it. And I had worked my way all the way up to story 7, The Good Bargain. I was trying to do these in order. And The Good Bargain, I didn't realize this until I went through it, is anti-Semitic. It's got like the Jew as the bad guy, and quite explicitly is, saying that he's kind of greedy because he's Jewish. And I was like, geez, okay. Do I skip this one? It's really going to bug me if I skip one, because I want to do the whole thing complete. Do I try and change this so he's not a Jew anymore? Or do I do the story as normal, but then add on some editorializing afterwards? Or, it was another reason why the project lost momentum. Obviously, the same thing would have just been to skip it. I didn't realize that the anti-Semitic stuff would be coming up by story number 7 already. And again, I was reading these stories as I go, so I hadn't read everything. I knew the anti-Semitic stuff would be coming up at some point, because even just looking at the table of contents, you can see there's a story called, what is it called? It's called like The Jew in the Thorn Bush. Yeah, The Jew Among Thorns. And if you go to that one in 528, which I actually haven't read yet in its entirety, but if you just go to it, the publishers, in this case Wordsworth Classics, said, the publishers have included this story because it is a literal rendering of the Grimm's work and is of literary and historical interest. The stereotyping that it expresses is both obvious and obnoxious, and modern readers will draw their own conclusions. Yeah, I agree with that. I'm not pro-censorship, and it's a historical work, so you can't censor the classics. There's nothing to do but leave it in, and then just include that note with it. As far as Wordsworth goes, though, as far as me making videos on YouTube, though, that might be a different case. Or I don't know. Debate amongst yourself in the comments. What's the best way to handle that? So, anyways, I got up to the first 7 stories on my YouTube project. Plus, I actually started with story number 52, The Golden Bird, just because the project on, no, not 52, what was it? The Golden Bird, which is, I think, one of the 50s, because I was going off of, here we go, The Golden Bird, 57, story number 57, because I was going off of the copy on Project Gutenberg originally, and they started with 57. It turns out the one on Project Gutenberg, or at least the first link that you click, because they've got a few different versions up there, has the stories out of their canonical order, and I think doesn't have all the complete stories in that first link. But I've since found this one at a bookstore in Vietnam. I mean, they're all up on Wikipedia anyways, all the stories. But I got this from a bookstore in Vietnam. Vietnam is where I'm living and working. Vietnam, for whatever reason, has a lot of Wordsworth classics. So the selection of books in Vietnam is very limited, but they've got a lot of the classic books, and they're all the Wordsworth edition. So I've become very familiar with Wordsworth over the years I've been living in Vietnam. For example, just off my shelves here, the Don Quixote book I read was also Wordsworth. So the Wordsworth classic books tend to be whatever is in the public domain. They must be very cheap books. So the publishers don't want to spend any extra money. And it's usually the oldest translation. And so there's this translation here, which is using all of this Shakespearean English. How is this reading? It's all these and thous and thys, and all these STs at the end of the words, like thou sleepest, or stuff like that, which strikes me as strange, because the Grimm brothers are old, but they're not that old. They're from the 19th century, and then whoever translated this book into English, and I'm not sure who it was here. They don't list the translator in this edition, or at least I can't find it here. I don't know if I'm missing it somewhere. But yeah, whichever edition they went with here, this translation here, wherever it was from, is obviously one of the oldest public domain translations, which was using all Shakespearean English for some reason. I don't know. Maybe because these were supposed to be traditional tales that the Brothers Grimm were retelling, so they were using Shakespearean English because they were supposed to be traditional tales, or maybe the Brothers Grimm themselves were using an older form of German, and I don't know. So I wish I would have had a more modern translation. It may have made this a little bit more readable. The stories are readable enough and very simple and not necessarily intellectually challenging, but I'm having trouble immersing myself in them. I find it very easy to get a couple paragraphs in and then be like, okay, what else is going around the house? What's on Twitter right now? Um, and partly that's because of the old style of the narration, but partly that's because the narration style is just really telling you the bare bones of what happened without giving you without immersing you into the scene at all. Um, so there's certainly some interesting things happening in the story, but they're all happening, very quickly. And it's like you're reading a summary of a story, maybe more than you are actually reading the whole story. And I find it hard to get into and to immerse myself into. And that's one of the reasons why I was trying to do this as a YouTube project or a storytelling project, because it gave me an excuse to go through and get into a story in a way that I couldn't get into when I was just laying on my couch. The other thing, of course, is it's just a bunch of short stories. So it's the same problem with every short story collection, is you get through one story and then it's a little bit difficult to reset and get yourself into the next story. At least it is for me. But I'm going to stick with this because I want to read the whole thing, if for no other reason than just to say I read the whole thing. I mean, it's a classic. And I think the Brothers Grimm were interesting people, the little I know about them. Jacob Grimm was involved with a lot of the political issues of his day, I believe, and involved in historical linguistic work. So I think it would be neat to read, just to kind of, I don't know, historical value or cultural value or something like that. Actually, I was watching a YouTube video on the Brothers Grimm. I don't now remember what video it was, so I can't give you the link. I watched this a couple years ago when I was first starting my project. But it was some guy giving a lecture on the legacy of the Brothers Grimm storybook. And he said when it first came out, people didn't know what to make of it. They weren't quite sure if it was meant to be enjoyed as a collection of stories or if it was supposed to be a work of scholarship. Because the premise behind the Brothers Grimm is they were going out and they were collecting all the common folk stories in Germany so that they could preserve them and archive them. Now that's the image that the Brothers Grimms themselves wanted to create. If you research this at all, people will say that they weren't entirely honest, because they were actually refining it and taking out stories, and they wanted to kind of they didn't want something authentic. They wanted something that was palatable and marketable and presented a nice version of Germany. And so that's why some of those darker stories got taken out in the later editions. But even then, it contains a lot of stories that are of maybe varying quality, or at least of varying interest. And people were not exactly sure what to make of them, or whether you were just supposed to sit down and read the whole thing cover to cover or what. And then, according to the same guy, he said later they published a different version, which was a condensed one of just the greatest hits. So, Cinderella, Snow White, Rapunzel. And he said that book did very well. So the selected Brothers Grimm did very well. And I have a feeling if you went to a bookstore now and went to the shelves, it would be a selected Brothers Grimm that you would see, or at least that would be maybe more prominently displayed than the complete Brothers Grimm. I don't know. Let me know what your experience is at your local bookstore. But yeah, to actually sit through and kind of read the whole thing cover to cover is something that people even at the time found apparently a little bit unappealing. The greatest hit stories, the selected stories, did much better. But I'm going to try and get through the whole thing. So I went back to the beginning this week and started with the first one, the Frog King, or Iron Henry. This is often known in English as the Frog Prince. Well, one of the things I actually discovered when doing this story a couple of years ago is that in the Brothers Grimm version, the princess does not kiss the frog. In the Brothers Grimm version, the princess gets really angry at the frog and throws him against the wall, and then that turns him into a prince. Now, why does that turn him into a prince is never explained in the story, which is typical of these stories. There's a lot of like leaps in logic where you think, okay, there must be a scene missing here. But it does. The fact of being... Sorry about that noise in the background. The fact about being that he got hurled against the wall is what broke the spell, and then he turned into the prince. Now, if you go to Wikipedia, I think Wikipedia says the thing about him getting kissed, the princess kissing the frog, comes from, I believe, if I'm remembering this right, an English guy who changed the story later. And that version has obviously become more famous, at least in the English-speaking world. It's called the Frog King in here, and not the Frog Prince. And it's also called Or Iron Henry. And the reason it's called Or Iron Henry is just really because of the last two paragraphs, where the prince, the Frog Prince or the Frog King, reunites with his servant, Henry. And Henry was so heartbroken when his master was turned into a frog that he had his heart bound with iron. And then when he sees his master come back to his human form, his heart kind of gets bigger and grows, and then the iron snaps off. And that's where the Iron Henry comes in. And then the Cat and Mouse in Partnership, book story 2. This is another one of those stories that nobody else really knows about, unless you actually sit down and read the whole collection. I think, let me know if I'm wrong, it's a rather darkly humorous story that has a tragic end for the mouse, without giving anything away. And then Our Lady's Child. Now this one is strange. A lot of them are strange. Our Lady, in this sense, refers to the Virgin Mary, who is the principal supernatural power in this story. It's got very Catholic trappings on it, which I was thinking about this the other day, right? Germany is a Protestant country, right? Brothers Grimm would have been Protestant, but this is talking about Virgin Mary up in heaven, and the saints and the angels and stuff like that. Actually, a lot of these stories have kind of Christian mythology or Catholic trappings on them. This one, like all the rest in the stories, all the rest of the stories in the collection, really moves at so much of a breakneck speed that it's difficult to get yourself immersed in any one scene. But there are some really interesting and trippy scenes in here. There's a description of this girl living up in heaven, which it sounds really weird, like angels playing with her and all these doors being locked and stuff like that. And then when she gets banished from heaven, she's put down, as described as a desert in the middle of a forest where there's all these brambles that are kind of keeping her in that place. I'm about to run out of time on this video, aren't I? So I'm going to have to stop here. I'm not going to talk about the rest of the stories that I read this week. But I'll come back next week and maybe talk some more about the Brothers Grimm.